Hello, everyone. It's Friday, May 22nd, 2026. At 11 o'clock tonight, CBS News Radio will broadcast for the very last time, 98 years after Edward R. Murrow first went live from Vienna as Hitler's troops marched in. Wednesday night, Stephen Colbert said goodnight from the Ed Sullivan Theater after 11 years of holding power to account, in spite of being the #1 rated late-night talk show. And this week, the Trump administration set aside $1.776 billion, a number chosen to echo the date of the Capitol attack and America's own liberation date, to compensate people who stormed that building and killed D.C. cops. This was an affront to survivors of 9/11 who had to fight for benefits for their losses committed by terrorists. 3 stories, one through line. Watchdogs are going quiet and the criminals are getting paid. I'm Richard Schreiber.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Great to be with you, and we'll introduce our wonderful guest in just a moment. Yeah, no, absolutely. CBS News Radio was an institution. I got my start in the early 80s at CBS News in the Washington Bureau, and many of my friends were really focused on the radio news, and it was the home of Edward R. Murrow, like you said, covering Hitler marching into Vienna in 1938. We also heard about Murrow's Boys. I did some work with Charles Osgood, who was certainly a CBS radio institution, and so on. Again, it's concerning. It's sad to see that chapter come to a close. The Fairness Doctrine of 1949 builds a legal framework to protect exactly that standard of integrity in broadcasting. President Reagan killed that doctrine in 1987. Stephen Colbert of The Late Show went dark last night after 11 years and 33 years of that show. I remember when David Letterman was...
David Letterman, the founder, yeah.
And as you said, Richard, CBS Radio goes dark tonight. It's really hard to believe. And our guest's new film, our guest Michele Mitchell's new film, OGs, is about people who broke unjust laws and waited decades for history to catch up. This is the insurrectionists are not waiting. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. They already are waiting for the check in the mail, so to speak. I'm Tom Martin. Again, this is True Journalism. Back to you, Richard.
Yeah, so our special guest today, Michele Mitchell, has spent her career documenting exactly what happens when power decides who counts as a victim and who does not. She directed The Uncondemned, which helped make rape a prosecutable war crime at the Rwanda Tribunal. She tracked $1.4 billion in Haiti earthquake donations and found conditions actually worsened. Her latest project, as Tom mentioned, is OGs regarding the early cannabis industry. She reported from the campaign trail and anchored at CNN. She's the co-founder of Film at 11. Michele Mitchell, welcome to True Journalism. It's really a pleasure to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here, especially as you both have pointed out this week. Very historically important moment in the world of journalism with CBS Radio going dark is just unbelievable to me. And as somebody who, one of the greatest days of my career was winning the Murrow Award for Haiti Where the Money Go. And it was so exciting because, and also my mentors were Garrick Utley, Bill Myers. That's how they all started. And then to have that fall away, I think it's important that we have a game plan so that people coming up through the ranks right now get the appropriate training and guidance and have the same public service that really drove so many of us into this career.
Yeah. And CBS, Tom and I have talked about, in particular, Tom has a lot of strong roots there. In particular, is Under Siege. We're understanding what Barry Weiss is doing with 60 Minutes, seeing Anderson Cooper's farewell and where that's all going. So one by one, voices are being silenced, which is just an affront to journalism. You describe your approach as responsibly rogue. When did you realize? When did you realize the story you need to tell couldn't really stay within the guidelines of institutional journalism?
The thing is that journalism, what's happened this week has been happening for a long time. And I'm going to give you an example because this is a direct line back to CBS. I when I left Bill Moyers, that show came to an end. So my job came to an end. And I was actually up for a job at CBS. And I remember the then president of the network telling me, we're going to step away from investigative journalism. We're going to do more entertainment and big interviews. And I just remember sitting in the office going, oh my God, I am about to get a job I don't want in an industry that is going to be dead and a brand that's going to be broken within 5 years. Now, it took a little longer than that, but look, that meeting was in 2005. So here we are, all these years later, and it's been a gradual breaking. And I'll give you another example, because I love telling this story about Walter Isaacson. I know people think that he's amazing. I do not, and I will tell you why. When I was at CNN Headline News, I was the political anchor, as you mentioned, and after 9/11, I was doing a lot of exposés on the fact that some of the legislation that was being passed by Congress, and that included suspending habeas corpus. I got called in, not just me, other journalists within the network also got called in and told directly by Walter Isaacson, you need to be more patriotic in your reporting. We're trying to win a war here. And I was like, wait, what? I think it's pretty patriotic that I read the Patriot Act, which exposés. But I was new to broadcast journalism. I really wish I had stood toe to toe with him and told him I thought that was absurd. But that was 2001. So this has been happening for quite some time. And so when I decided to break away, I honestly didn't think I'd work in documentaries. As Tom knows, I started a really tiny internet content company, and we did some short things for YouTube and started experimenting. And then that led to me making documentary films. But it became pretty clear by 2010, 2011, that if I wanted to tell the kinds of stories that would move the needle and create real change, I had to look outside of what we call mainstream media, because as these mergers were happening and as it became more of rewarding the shareholders as opposed to that idea of public service, there was not going to be space for the kinds of stories I wanted to do. So, but I want to be responsible, right? I wasn't like I was going to be in the Wild West and making up my own rules. So that's why I came up with Responsibly Rogue.
That's a great moniker. And I know
Question for you. There's so many intertwined forces here. It's just a complicated picture, but it's important that we look at it. I think all three of us believe. So you have these kind of twin forces, the Trump presidency, but also the evolution of technology and news distribution. I'm almost embarrassed or ashamed to say this, but when I heard about Barry Weiss's speech to all staff, he was telling people, hey, the times are changing. And I thought, times are changing, and how people get their news is changing.
yes.
But do we really have to abandon, like you said, in the Murrow days, it's so beautiful that you won that award. I can see how that's the perfect fit for you, your dedication. Richard and I often talk about that sense of civic responsibility, but has that just been overrun? You hear about Jeff Bezos slashing the staff of the Washington Post in half again. And you said you felt you saw the writing on the wall years ahead of time. And before we started rolling, you were talking about finding new distribution channels for people who do have the conscience. So all of these things seem intertwined a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I want to point to your point about how do people get the news. If you talk to anybody under the age of 35, they're not reading the Washington Post. They're not watching the CBS News. They're not listening to CBS Radio. So one of the things I always find interesting is, okay, how do you hear it? And what's fascinating about the answer, that 9 times out of 10, what they say is, oh, I hear it from a friend I trust. And that is a really interesting thing happening, because if in a world in which you don't trust your news sources, and there's a million reasons for them not to trust this.
Yes.
How do you break through? And so I love talking to my nieces and my nephew about this. And I remember asking them, I don't know if you guys remember that there was this rumor, no joke, on TikTok that Helen Keller didn't exist. And I asked my nieces, I was like, hey, do you believe this? That the Helen Keller didn't exist?
Hearsay or I say?
My older niece said, yeah, how could she accomplish everything they said she did? It doesn't make any sense. And I was like, but she did. And I'm like, we know this. And she looks at me and says, how do you know, Aunt Shelley? Were you there? And I'm like, oh my God, I realize you think I'm as old as dirt, but no. there. But that idea of how do you know, were you there? So I will tell you, I was mentioning to you before we started, I have this talk that I'm giving to go along with the movie as we're in production. But I make sure that I let people know I was there. I am there. I make sure that I actually sprinkle that in there because there is an authenticity. We are in a world in which truth and authenticity are luxury items. So it's really having that experience is incredibly important. But again, how do you convey that out there? How does it break through everything else? And I saw the Bezos interview. Did you guys see that he gave to CNBC yesterday? Fascinating. What a piece of work, man. I get asked all the time, who do you hope will buy this movie? And I'm like, I don't have any faith that a Jeff Bezos wouldn't totally
Really?
86 my movie.
You didn't like the Melania movie?
Idiot for him. Yeah.
Which is something.
Yeah,
That's
that's true.
One follow-up question, then you're back to you, Richard. A friend of mine, I've told Richard about this. For 12, 13 years, I've had a friend in Newtown, Connecticut, Scarlett Lewis, and she's a mom who lost her 6-year-old son, Jesse, one of the 20 little children killed in that school shooting. And almost immediately after that, probably that same day, people started talking about they're probably going to take away our guns now and things like that. But within certainly a couple of days, a couple of weeks, some people start saying, like the moon landing, that was all fake. Did you know those parents are real actors and so on? And so my friend Scarlett, faced down. I never listened to Alex John's radio show or whatever. But like you said, the younger generation who listens to, it's clear the influence of podcasts and so on, the terrible Charlie Kirk shooting and things like this. It's how do you get a handle on this world and make sure that the truth really gets through?
Well, I'll even make it worse. The murder of Charlie Kirk was a very clear example of nihilism in action. And the last time that we have experienced a rise in nihilism like we are right now would have been at the turn of the 20th century. And that would be the anarchist movement, etc. But there's a direct parallel, and it's very scary because if you don't believe in anything, if we're not giving you something to believe in, what do you do? I mean, that sense of hopelessness is out there, tangible. Yes. And that, to me, as trying to be a truth teller out there, is an incredibly alarming thing.
And then you have Candace Owens, who's trying to shine a light on that whole debacle and what actually did happen. And it's almost like it's almost JFK in proportion to what she's purporting as a cover-up and what the real story is there. And you make a great point, Michelle, about news sources. And we've uncovered a lot of deepfakes on YouTube. I think a lot of kids get their news from YouTube, which is often distilled excerpts from MS Now, Fox, whatever. And sometimes they're edited in some ways because they're not really coming from official sources. And then, I see stuff all the time from Rachel Maddow, from other reporters that is clearly not them, just deepfake stuff. And George Will, who is a Republican that I've always appreciated because he loves baseball mostly. But I saw some obviously AI rendered content from him. Yeah, I'm a Mets fan. Don't hold that against me.
Dude, I'm sorry. You are off to a really rough start.
Oh my God, this year's been horrific. Anyway, but you raised a good point because Tom and I, those of us who have studied journalism, and I have a book in the work called The Decline of American Journalism. And the Fairness Doctrine was like strike one when the Reagan administration, actually there was a bill to retain it, but Ronald Reagan vetoed it in 1987. And many people said it was to prevent what happened with Richard Nixon in the party to never happen again. It came under the guise of, because of evolving media, it was more and more difficult to provide equal access and so on and so forth. But that really was the start. And then, of course, in the 90s, with all the corporate acquisitions of news channels, and to your point, in that meeting in 2000, where they're talking about entertainment, people from advertising backgrounds became head of news organizations. And it just totally diminished the traditional aspects of journalism. You were a CNN anchor in
Headline News. I was at Headline News,
Headline News, yes. And a female who once reported on the campaign trail, Trump has repeatedly admonished women reporters, calling them piggy. I know Tom has deep thoughts about that. On Air 41, dumb and terrible persons. You lived in that world before it got bad. What did institutional journalism do or fail to do to protect the women in the newsroom these days?
Well, I don't think anything has made me as angry as hearing the president of the United States saying, "Quiet, piggy." And in fact, so I'm from Yorba Linda, birthplace of Richard Nixon, and I was mine to see my mom, and she's still there. These two little old ladies are sitting behind me, and that's all they could talk about. And one of them said, "I am a hardcore Republican. I am never voting for that man again." And I don't think he understands how absolutely it's a very triggering thing, especially for older women. We
Yeah.
thought we were past that. So I thought a lot about that particular instance because I started out as a sports writer. And when I started out in sports, I went to Western as we were discussing, and I wrote sports for the Chicago Tribune. And was on the sports page around the time. Do you remember there was a reporter for the Boston Globe, a sports writer, where there was a very infamous incident where she was covering I think it was a Red Sox game, maybe a hockey game. Anyway, basically,
Yeah, I went to school there, so I knew a lot of the journalists.
Yeah, exactly. And so I remember, so when I started the sports page, I was the youngest by a lot. I was 19, and I was one of two women. And I have to tell you, I was so protected by the editors, by my fellow reporters. And I was in a lot of newsrooms, or not newsrooms, a lot of locker rooms, and I was at the conferences. And a couple times maybe something happened and it got shut down by the other reporters and also the coaches. The men stood up for the women. And that's really what it takes. The fact that none of the guys said anything, I think really speaks to another thing that's happening right now, which is accepted misogyny. And it's infusing everything right now. And I'm blown away by how accepted that this has become. And it's enraging. But at the same time, one of the reasons it's happening is that for the first time in U.S. history, women have as much of their own money to invest as men do. And that's not before. So this economic freedom that didn't exist when I was growing up, up until the late 70s in the state of California, a woman couldn't have a bank account unless her husband.
You couldn't have a credit card until the mid 80s if you were.
There you go, and a mortgage. But so the economic freedom that women now have, you see the rise of misogyny, it's in direct correlation to this, right? And trying to shut this down. And you hear these smatterings of women shouldn't have the right to vote. We're going to repeal that amendment and blah, blah. Good luck, buddy. But I think that the way that the president treats women, it's unvarnished. This is who he is. And I wish that somebody had turned to him in any of these instances and said, you can't talk that way. We'll get to that point. But certainly, I think that the White House press corps, you got to stand up for each other because nobody else is going to do it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he deploys women in high places and then demeans them, admonishes them, and diminishes them.
He's a misogynist. Let's face it. And it's just, and he looks at women as objects. And if you, God bless those three women who I never thought I'd want to have a drink with in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and Nancy Mace, because they faced him down, and we have the Epstein files because of them.
Yes.
And all you need to know about that guy is the fact that he was so close to a person who everybody knew what Jeffrey Epstein was up to, right? Look, I'm going to tell another story about my mother. A total conservative, but when he paved over Jackie's rose garden, that was it. She was livid about that. He tore down the East Wing. What else do we need to know about how this rolls?
Yeah, and this whole 1776, and I know, Tom, you wanted to talk more about that, because it's not just about the slush fund, which is what people are calling it, for the January 6th victims, which is really, as I mentioned earlier, a tremendous affront to the families of 9/11.
Administration, it's like,
Yeah.
There was a woman on Facebook right after January 6th, and she's on the school board in Yorba Linda, my former hometown. And she was talking about, I just happened to be in DC and I just happened to wander into this. I posted on there on her Facebook. I'm like, I'm reporting you to the FBI right now. And I did. It was super satisfying. And anybody, I will take this argument with anybody who thinks that those guys were patriots or did. No, that's
People
treason.
died. People were assaulted. People were killed.
Yes, people were killed. And it was just-
because they were directed to do so by the ex-president and the complicity of his inner cabinet, all of which was laid out in all the indictments.
The tagline of my new film, which is OG with an asterisk, and the asterisk is right side of history, wrong side of the law. And I have to say, history, the wheels of history grind slow but fine. And the people who were complicit in that, they will find their day. Because as my other film was about the trial that made rape an international war crime, which happened after the Rwandan genocide. And
Yes.
the top guys, they were caught, they were sentenced. Many of them have since been released, but it's the middle guys who could have stopped it and who did it. And
Who
under
didn't?
and under
Yeah.
Article 6.3 of the Geneva Accords, that makes you as culpable as the person giving the order. And so all those people in the middle who are just going along to get along, dude, that's who history is going to come for. You, not Trump, but you. And you're in a
Yep.
lot of trouble.
Because
If I was Kristi Noem right now,
oh
I'd
man,
be lawyering up.
and she is, because Trump tried to smear her just as he did Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I think everyone in the MAGA party should be mandatorily have to review the Nuremberg trials, because that's where this is heading. I was only following orders. I'm of German descent, so I've studied a lot of my own country's history, and the remorse that the generation of German people that were part of that whole is just extraordinary, which is why Germany is the second largest contributor to Israel for foreign aid, because they have in perpetuity, they feel the necessity to make restitution for what happened during the Holocaust so that it never, ever permeates their culture again. What's happening these days is just...
A truth and reconciliation process like they had in South Africa is probably what's going to be necessary. But one of the things that I find remarkable about what's happening now, and by the way, that I think, Tom, you wanted to also address the fact that in addition to the slush fund, and forever, we will never audit you. We're in journalists here.
About is their line written into this declaration establishment of the fund.
Yeah.
No surveillance, I know they're the government, so they have power.
Yeah.
The CEO of a large corporation says, I can never be surveilled, and so I have to.
Not only that,
Excuse me, you can't really put that in the.
but he's...
I love it because it means that he's guilty. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That he just made our job awful.
He's been accused of insider trading, dropping before his actions in the Iran war, of Venezuela, whatever it is, so that when the market tanks, all of his billionaire, trillionaire friends can short the market and still make money as the market goes down, and then make money on the uptick. But all of that is absolved in this agreement with the DOJ in this landmark settlement. He can't be convicted for any crimes of insider trading. He doesn't pay taxes on the windfall. If he cheats on his taxes, he's exempt from IRS prosecution. It is just, I just hope the American people are really paying attention.
I think this is something that people can understand, though. And that's why, so like when Bezos was trying, in his interview, was like, I pay a lot in tax, but dude, we know you don't. Stop it. No, you don't. And you're so insulated with, I think it's Krugman who calls it billionaire brain. You're so insulated that you aren't understanding how much people hate you right now. And you pay for people to like you. You can't. And the pitchforks are going to come. Historically speaking, we've been here before. We know what's going to happen. The question really, and I don't have the answer for this, I've got a pretty good guess, is how do we all react? And then also, again, journalism is the first draft of history, right? I think we all agree with that. And are we equipped to properly cover these things and get that information out in a responsible way, and that people will read and pay attention to?
Absolutely. Love to hear more about your current film.
Yeah.
In terms of, like you said, it's an insight into history as well.
I have to make an admission. I grew up in New Paltz, New York in the 1970s. So that should give you a little
I
bit
know where
back.
this is going.
So I am a reformed, whatever.
I am not someone who smokes weed or does gummies or anything.
And I don't recommend it. No.
My lane is wine. Look, there's a lot. Honestly, I think that I've heard a lot about plant medicine and all that stuff. But what was interesting to me was, and the reason why I wanted to do this story was because when I went up into the Emerald Triangle is Mendocino, Humboldt, and Trinity counties. So it's in the Redwood. It's north of wine country. And it really is the epicenter of what became the marijuana industry as we know it in the United States, because people moved, a lot of anti-war protesters, and moved back to the land, right? And a lot of Vietnam veterans were there as well. The land was inexpensive, and the idea was self-sufficiency. So they smoked weed, so they weren't going to buy it. So they were like, threw some seeds in the ground, but they were tinkerers. They had to be, because they're off grid. They had to build everything themselves. And a lot of them were scientists, engineers, and scholars, and they traveled a lot. So that you got all these different seeds coming, and they heard about the stuff in Afghanistan.
Jesus. It sounds like it's not analogous to making wine, Michelle.
It is a little bit, to be honest with you. But so what they ended up crossing and tinkering with did change the world of marijuana, like around the world. But what was interesting was when I went up there to start talking to people about this secret history, I saw I saw physical signs of PTSD, and I know what those are because I've had it. But anybody who's been in a conflict zone is very susceptible to trauma. And I was like, wait a minute, what happened up here? And then that's when I heard about the helicopters, and I heard about the asset forfeiture, and I heard about the home invasions, and then kids being taken away from their parents under charges of child endangerment. And that's when this became a different story. And then I heard about something called Operation Green Sweep, which happened during 1990. George H.W. Bush sent in the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry into the Emerald Triangle to enforce domestic criminal law, which of course is unconstitutional. It's in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, to be very specific. And that community rightly read this as, if we don't take a stand, they're going to do this in more vulnerable communities under the guise of the war on drugs. And that community fought back, and they did it in all sorts of interesting ways. They did it the anti-war protester way of a sit-in and a protest and a lawsuit. And then they did it, and the second generation of growers was a little bit more crazy, because that's the go-go days. And they slashed tires and parked buses and abandoned vehicles. And my very favorite thing they did was they snuck into the VIPs' hotel rooms and wiped down the sheets with poison oak and called it a special turn-down service. So that was an operation. It was supposed to last 3 weeks. It lasted 10 days, and the federal government did not do it again. And so as I'm learning about this, I'm like, you know what? There's so many parallels to what's happening today.
Yeah,
And
especially with ICE.
yeah, and when you see some of the footage, you realize we did this to our own people. Wait, what? But they not only pushed back, they created an industry that was never even meant to be an industry. And I think that they show us that you can take that road less traveled, even if everyone around you tells wrong, because you might be right. But to the point that you guys started with when we began our conversation, this idea of what's a criminal and what's an outlaw. And one of the things that I wanted to ask and answer in this movie is, okay, who gets to make the rules? And what if those rules are made very specifically to keep you out, to oppress you, to marginalize you? Does it make you a criminal if you break those rules? And the people in my film, even though they are still regarded as federal criminals because cannabis is still federally illegal.
Yeah.
To me, they're outlaws. The people who are the criminals are the ones in the Epstein files. Flat out. And I like this question of what makes a criminal, what makes an outlaw, because as one of the OGs in my film says, it is the duty of every citizen to protest an unjust law. And I think that there's never been a better time for us to learn that civics lesson again.
Especially when we're being bombarded by executive actions that are not only unconstitutional, but borderline illegal.
Yes.
And we're pushing against the courts, the federal courts that kind of check that. But then the next ball gets handed off to the Supreme Court. And now we're basically being held up by whatever the Supreme Court decrees. And we know how their leanings are these days. But yeah, it's interesting because Tom and I have talked about a lot of these instances are apolitical. It's like more people were deported under Barack Obama than any other president because he was a good administrator. He was incredibly effective, whereas Trump is not. He's an incredibly bad administrator, which is why they've wasted billions of dollars on ICE and got an ineffectual response. Those are facts. If Obama had been given that kind of money, I hate to think about how many people additionally would have been deported. Bill Clinton, the war on drugs that you mentioned, exploded under Bill Clinton. Over 1 million Black African-American young men imprisoned because of drug crimes that really should have been misdemeanors or not even imprisoned.
I actually talked about this in my lecture that I gave on Monday, which you will be at in New York soon. But one of the things I talk about, I was on Capitol Hill in 1994 when we passed the crime bill, which established federal mandatory minimum sentencing. And that's exactly what sent all those young Black men in particular to prison. And frankly, Bill Clinton was not a good president. I resent the fact that I ended up voting for his wife. And I only voted for her because I wasn't going to vote for Donald Trump.
Exactly.
He was not a great president at all. And in fact, how he spent his time in office, oh my God, what a wasted opportunity. And I could go on, but he had his time and wasted it. But the federal mandatory minimum sentencing, which still exists, by the way, our off-camera narrator is a Black man who just finished serving his sentence. And he got the mandatory minimum of 10 years without any priors. And he had to serve out that time. My on-camera narrator, by the way, is also my producer, and that's Woody Harrelson. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So somebody who's been on the right side of these arguments forever, and a chapeau to him for standing up for the people who have been voiceless. But yeah, the prison industrial complex, which frankly, there aren't as many people being sentenced now, which is probably why they're building these detention centers, right? Gotta have some. You gotta
diversify, right? And Bill Clinton, to his credit, at least subsequently said many years later, he regretted passing that bill.
You know what? I don't care. And I'll tell you why. He also said he regretted not getting in, trying to prevent the Rwandan genocide. And it's unacceptable for these people to say years later, oh, I regret that. Guess what? A lot of people there are people in history who have stood up at the right time and done the right thing, and they've done so at great harm to themselves, mentally and physically, and they have given up a lot to stand up and do that. And so when a total chicken like Bill Clinton says that, dude, I'm sorry, history called you and you didn't pick up.
And think of Abraham Lincoln. There's a man who stood up and faced the music.
Yeah, there's him, and there's so many people that you don't even hear about who do the right thing. I was just rereading King Leopold's, and there was a guy, Edward Morrell, who is the reason why we even heard anything about what Leopold was doing in Congo and all of the horrific crimes against humanity that were occurring. This guy was a clerk. He was a clerk for a shipping company. It was a very comfortable job. And he looking at the records of, okay, all this ivory is coming in and we're shipping out weapons. What's going on? And he's the one who blew the cover on this. Yeah. And he also spoke out against World War I and said all these countries had these secret agreements. And he was prosecuted by his own government of the EU. Went to prison for this, but he was right. There were all these secret agreements. So in a world in which you could be that guy or Bill Clinton, be that guy. I'll also say that the OGs in my film, I did ask them, was it worth it? And because they're not rich, they're not famous, they've suffered a lot. And all of them were like, yeah, look at the cool life I've led and look at all the neat things I've done. And I thought, you know what, you want to finish well. And I'm sorry, I'm up on my soapbox because nothing like these people who are in a position of power and who screw it up.
We have that in common. Tom, you get the last question before we head to our section where we call the top
Yes,
5
that-
propaganda
that-
stories, which we would love you to
fascinating.
dial in on also.
Yeah, no, you're welcome to join in. I don't know. This is not a small question, but just I don't think you have any time limits here. Speaking of cowardly behavior, you mentioned the Epstein files earlier. What are your thoughts about that? We'd love to hear more about that.
So, okay, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. The main thought that I think is really important here is, first of all, I met Jeffrey Epstein. I actually had to drink with him once. I met him. I was in. It was very safe for me because I was 36 at the time, so all good.
Huh.
But here's the thing: that I met him in 2006, and so that was after his first arrest, right? And the infamous one where he didn't really have to serve much of a sentence. And then I was also on I was part of the Rolodex that Peggy Siegel had. Peggy Siegel being the PR guru who had a lot of events and everything. And she did a lot of Oscar campaigns. And so I was part of a seat filler basically for these different parties. But I have to say, everybody knew what was going on with Jeffrey Epstein. And so when I hear people say, oh, I went to his house and I had dinner, but I didn't know, I'm sorry, you all knew. I was really low on the totem pole and I knew. And Tina Brown, one of the very few people I've ever heard of who didn't go to his parties because she called it like it was. But there were plenty of people in our profession who went to those parties and they knew what was going on. And I think that they're also culpable of carrying the water and I always wonder about these people who were willing to take his money or his connections, and they knew how he accumulated all this stuff. And they were able to reason out in their brains that it was okay because, oh, I'll get to do my scientific study, or, oh, I'll get to make my movie. And a phrase that describes how they did this, and it also applies to Bill Clinton saying, oh, I regret, blah, blah, blah. It's called a true alibi. So you're not lying to yourself. These are alibis, but they're true alibis because you believe this. You truly have convinced yourself of this. And shame on all of them, honestly. And I think we actually have to call them on it and say, there has to be some sort of
higher accountability, really, is what. And I think with respect to the Epstein, there's some people look at the atrocities that were done to the women, which are just incredibly unforgivable. That was just the entertainment. The real happening there was the power brokering.
Yep.
Was Epstein's ability to gather intel, and some say he worked with Mossad or whatever it is to create this blackmail scheme that he used against people, either to keep them quiet or keep them coming back or whatever that is. Yeah, it was a power cabal that introduced people of influence to one another. Deals were made, influence was peddled. Yep. And to your point, it's like you don't go into a barbershop unless you want to get a haircut. So if you're going there, you have eyes wide open.
And I can tell you, like, the circumstances in which I met him, I was actually going out with a guy at the time whose dad was really good friends with him. And he was introducing me to his dad. And there's Jeffrey.
Oh, boy.
Whoa. I remember asking me, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm an investigative reporter.
Oh, just who I want to talk to.
Yeah. No.
All right.
Yeah.
This has been amazing. Tom, you want to segue us to...
We always close our episodes with 5 stories in the news. We call it The Wire, the top 5 propaganda stories. I'll take first 2, just touch on them briefly. Michelle, if you want to add, feel free. We talked about some of this earlier, but number 1 is the January 6th Anti-Weaponization Fund. Again, 1.776 $1.776 billion fund to compensate victims of government weaponization, which is ridiculous. I do think of those police officers, and those are really the courageous heroes. And the fact that our Attorney General, acting Attorney General, is the former defense attorney of the president. What the F here? But anyway, that's number 1. Number 2.
Fortunately, Tom, we know that certain Capitol police officers have countersued to try to get this from happening. And we know that there's been some Republican support possibly too. So the spin of the administration is being countered by those who were there, which is a big thing.
Yeah. Glad to see some Republicans saying this is finally going too far, like you said, being complicit and on that memo level, said, this is too far. So we'll see. Number 2 is the 9/11 families versus the January 6th fund. So how would you describe this, Richard?
Yeah. So being a New Yorker and being here during 9/11 and knowing the aftermath of those families that were affected by it and what Jon Stewart did for many years to shame Congress and to keep the money flowing, many of them have looked at this as a direct slap in their face because these were people who lost others because of terrorists. And now some are saying we're rewarding terrorists with this fund. It's a juxtapose that is really shaking a lot of 9/11 and first responders who fought Congress for decades to get the money flowing. So now, and these people are eligible for cash payouts. This was reported in the Washington Post recently. It's just a really harmful juxtapose.
But yeah, please continue, Richard.
Yeah. So next item we're talking about is the Gaza aid blockade, the documented versus what was declared. So Israel and U.S. officials state humanitarian corridors are open and aid is reaching civilians in Gaza. But the UN and NGOs document systemic blockade, conditions worsening, Israel's security minister releasing videos taunting flotilla activists. The Malaysian PM said Israel must face justice. So, yeah, and of course, what's happening in Gaza is obviously a lightning rod for a lot of controversy, and we're not going to really go into that here, other than in the context of the reporting. And Tom has often talked about the Iran war, and I know you have a pretty funny line about that. It's between two authoritarian regimes, who can you trust in the press, essentially. And then the next item was the U.S. reverses on the Ukraine war crime accountability. The U.S. supports peace and a negotiated resolution in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Carnegie Endowment for International Peace say U.S. policy reversals are directly undermining international war crimes tribunals and accountability mechanisms for Russian aggression. And we've seen an uptick in the Russian aggression now that sanctions have been lifted and they're able to sell their oil and get weapons from other nations. And they've leveled up on the attacks in Ukraine, of course, as the rest of the world is paying attention to the Iran war and other things. One question I wanted to ask you, Michele, is this whole notion, and I've said this, that, and this is opinion, that it's almost like we're living in this reality show called Donald Trump's presidency. First was Venezuela, then Greenland, then all of these different things that people have obviously talked about was a distraction from Jeffrey Epstein and knocking him off the headlines. But it just, some of these things that happen just don't seem to make a lot of sense, from a journalism standpoint.
I think the Epstein files are not going away, and those are that we will eventually get to read them. And in fact, Thomas Massey, I got 7 more months left. Let's do this. And I'm like, oh my God, this is gonna be fun. I have to tell you, I was having drinks the other night with a couple friends of mine who also we were in the political game a long time. And I was like, dude, I cannot believe I miss Dick Cheney. This guy looks at me and says, I can't believe I'm nostalgic for the first Trump administration. That made a little more sense. Look, the really interesting thing right now that I'm watching is that there's literally something for everybody to hate about this guy. It's just across the ideological board at this point. And I truly believe that we do give the people what they think they want. You think you don't want the government helping you out or whatever, you start to learn exactly how much government does for you. And I don't think people want to be angry all the time at their neighbor. What Americans mostly want to do is have a backyard barbecue and argue about sports. Frankly.
Sport and money, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that because there's literally something for everybody to be mad about, we're going to watch those numbers go further and further down, and maybe we'll get ranked choice voting across the board so that we can beat back the gerrymandering. But I guess one thing I just want to tack onto this, and we skirted around it a little bit, but in a world in which 5 people basically control all of our distribution platforms, It's a very dangerous world. But there are other ways that people are getting information and stories out and the truth. And those are very exciting ways. And they're not digital. These are mostly analog. And that's a very exciting thing that's starting to happen. Because when you have these gatherings of people, that's when magic happens, right? And we're not talking about mobs. We're talking about, there's a word for it called collective effervescence. And that's that feeling, the energy you get when you have a shared purpose. And that could be singing song together or cheering in a game. But I think we're going to see, I am very optimistic, despite all of these terrible things that are happening, that shared humanity is going to prevail. And I think that's why we're seeing this desperate grab for pouring money at Trump's level, because the end is coming for that. You know?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And while authoritarianism, I think the latest number was 70% of governments around the world are authoritarianism, although probably now it's down to 67 since Viktor Orban got booted. But America we have never been a monarchy. We have never been under authoritarian rule, and we reject it. And we've been bombarded by it, obviously, with this administration. But the level of activism and protest is just at record levels. And they don't know what to do about this. We are not a nation of silent, herded people. We're not sheep.
That's the fact, the sort of the deciding factor here, right? Is that unlike Russia or even Hungary or some of these other places, we've had a couple hundred years now of a form of democracy, and no monarch, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we will snap back. But I do think people needed to learn the lesson. When you've got somebody standing up saying, I alone can fix it, there's something comforting about hearing someone say that, because you're like, oh, thank God, because it's overwhelming with all the craziness and all the changes and blah, blah, blah. It was comforting to people to hear that. But now we know there's no one person who can solve all this. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. So we're just going to have to find some ways to work together, because big challenges are ahead of us. Just wait until the climate crisis migration hits, because we're not far away from when you're going to have tens of millions of people on the move. And the only way we are going to survive this is together and with empathy. So,
and if we don't, there's Scandinavia and countries around the world that will do this, because they're more progressive minded and they're really focused on the collective of their people. And we were too. And hopefully we'll learn some valuable lessons I look at Trump as an accelerant to a long-standing activity in history of behavior in America that we just seem to not be held accountable on the world stage, because we are the world's police, because we are the richest nation, because we do things for our European friends and whatnot. But we have gotten away with, and you know this as an investigative reporter around the world, whether it's Noriega or Saddam or whoever, that we've supported these regimes, Shah of Iran, et cetera, that we've never been held accountable for a lot of these things. And maybe Trump is just the accelerant to really show us as Americans, we need to get back to our root and our core, what the founding fathers really built this country on. And that there is hope, I think, at least from my perspective. Michelle, hopefully you see it that way too.
I'm obviously a delusional optimist. I make documentary films.
God bless you,
I like hearing that you have great perspective. I mean,
yes,
your travels and your experience.
So our last story was around Raul Castro being indicted by this international justice. The DOJ's viewpoint was the U.S. holds perpetrators of international crimes accountable wherever they are. That should have a funny and an ironic ring to it. It's the same administration that withdrew ICC cooperation for allies, dismantled Gaza accountability mechanisms, pardoned 1,600 January 6 defendants, and Castro's indictment for a 1996 plane shoot-down precedes all domestic accountability collapses. So this is just an interesting way to put a pin on everything we talked about.
And it's enormously disturbing to me that this administration essentially starved that island. That blockade was about inflicting maximum pain on them. And that is a crime against humanity. And then to indict Raul Castro, again, Wait until we finally start really digging into all this stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
Marco Rubio, I'm sorry, dude. You will never get my vote for president. But
Yeah.
that's
know-
an important thing to do.
Yeah, for sure.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we should start speaking out for that and say, no, that's not what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about, we don't want people to murder. And anyway. Yeah.
So before we forget, tell everyone where they can learn more about your work, including your new film. That kind of.
So I guess I do post a little bit on social media. So you can find me on Instagram, which is MLMitchell70. And I do post a little bit about the movie. We'll be posting more as we're getting closer and closer to the release. And The Uncondemned is on Amazon.
How fitting.
Yeah, and then I do have a subset called the Cocktail Conversations, and I'm I'm not very assiduous at posting on that because I'm making a movie. But I do announce on Instagram and on Facebook when I do these talks and everything. So there'll be more of that being posted in the coming months.
That was wonderful. We really enjoyed it.
you
You've expanded our minds today. And
Yes.
provided reason for hope. So,
I think that I've seen the worst that people can do to one another in the course of my work. But I've also seen the very best. And I will always believe that my faith in humanity is completely justified. And I just think we need to start sticking up for each other a little bit more. Like I said earlier about the president calling women names. Come on, White House press corps, push back, stand up for each other. It's important that empathy becomes a good thing again. Because we've heard so much from this administration and from the tech oligarchs that empathy is bad. There's actually a book out, which the title is Empathy is a Sin, and it's being promoted in the church that Pete Hegseth belongs to. And
No surprise.
yeah, we need to start embracing these things that have made us a stronger country, historically speaking.
Yep.
And also the reason why all of us got into this profession to begin with. Journalists don't become famous or rich, but boy, do you do some good out there.
I'm with the two little old ladies behind you on the plane.
And boy, you have done some good, Michelle. So we are blessed to have you today. And thank you again for sharing your amazing story and your insights and your humanity. I think more than anything else. Yeah. We need civility and we need people in authority to start rediscovering that. And you go a long way to ushering that into our consciousness.
I'm not letting anybody off the hook also.
Off the hook, yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And hopefully I'll get to come back when the movie's...
Of course, we'd love it. And we'll...
Yeah, you can make a movie. You can make the movie version of this at some point, Ryan. If George Clooney can do it, we can do it.
Way more fun, I'm sure, than he is.
This has been great. Really appreciate it. And we're going to be cheering you on. Hope to see you in New York.
Yes, I'd love to. Please keep in touch. So we always close with Edward R. Murrow, what he said at the end of every broadcast. Good night and good luck.